She wore my hat and nothing else. Welcome to the world of Western romance. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The wind was a cruel master in these high reaches of the territory, a relentless force that clawed at the pines and scoured the granite faces of the mountains until they wept dust. For 3 weeks, U.S. Marshal Elias, known to all as just Marshal, had been its unwilling disciple, following a trail as cold and unforgiving as the gusts that chapped his face and worked their way into the very marrow of his bones. The Black Creek Gang, a pack of vicious hyenas who preyed on freight wagons and isolated homesteads, had vanished into this wilderness, and with them, any sense of warmth or progress. Now, with the sky turning the color of a deep bruise and the promise of a blizzard hanging heavy in the air, he was finally turning his horse, Ajax, toward the one place he could call his own. A small, sturdy cabin tucked so far into the grizzlies that most men didn't even know the valley existed. It was his sanctuary, a fortress of solitude built with his own hands, and the thought of its quiet embrace was the only thing that had kept him from turning back to the relative comfort of redemption a week ago. He craved the silence, the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the simple, uncomplicated peace of being utterly and completely alone. As Ajax crested the final ridge, the cabin came into view below, a dark, solid shape against the encroaching dusk. A profound sense of relief washed over Marshall, so potent it almost felt like joy. He urged the weary horse down the familiar, winding path, his mind already turning to the simple chores that would welcome him home. Stabling Ajax with a good measure of oats, splitting a little more kindling before the snows hit in earnest, and then sitting before a roaring fire with a bottle of whiskey and no one to answer to. Yet, as he drew closer, a subtle wrongness began to prick at the edges of his consciousness, a discordant note in the symphony of his homecoming. A thin, almost ghostly tendril of smoke was rising from the stone chimney, not the thick, hearty plume of a freshly built fire, but the lazy, dying breath of one that had been burning for some time. He drew Ajax to a halt, his hand resting instinctively on the cold buckskin of his rifle scabbard, his senses, honed by years of tracking men who did not wish to be found, flaring to life. He had doused the fire completely 3 weeks ago, smothering the embers with dirt until not a whisper of heat remained. Dismounting with a quiet grace that belied his tall, strong frame, he tethered Ajax to a low-hanging branch where the horse would be partially sheltered, his movements fluid and economical. The scent on the air was not just of the coming snow and the damp earth. Beneath it, faint but undeniable, was the smell of wood smoke laced with something else, something floral and sweet that had no place in this rugged, masculine world he had carved out for himself. His hand moved from his rifle to the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip, the familiar weight a comforting anchor in the rising sea of uncertainty. The cabin door was shut, just as he had left it, the heavy wooden bar locked from the outside. He slipped the bar free with a silent lift, his calloused fingers noting the lack of any fresh scratches on the wood. Whoever was inside had not forced their way in. They had found the spare key, a small, flat piece of iron he kept hidden under a loose stone in the foundation, a secret he had shared with no living soul. Marshall pushed the heavy door inward, the familiar low groan of the hinges sounding like a scream in the heavy silence. The interior of the cabin was awash in the gloomy twilight filtering through the 2 small windows, the air thick and warm. His gaze swept the single room, cataloging every detail with a lawman's precision. A fire was indeed dying in the hearth, a small pot of water set beside it, still giving off a faint steam. On the back of his own armchair, a splash of color drew his eye, a dress of mustard yellow, its hem torn and smeared with mud, the laces of its brown corset undone and dangling. His eyes narrowed into slits, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. This was not the work of the Black Creek Gang. They were brutes and killers, not subtle intruders. This felt different, more personal, and that made it infinitely more dangerous. He moved past the main living space toward the small alcove where his bed was built into the wall, his boots making no sound on the rough-hewn floorboards. The scent of lavender and rain-soaked woman was stronger here, a deeply unsettling perfume in the heart of his refuge. And then he saw her, curled in the center of his bed, lost in the tangle of his wool blankets and fur pelts, was a young woman. A wild cascade of dark brown curls spilled across his pillow, a bouncy fringe falling across a smooth, pale brow. She was fast asleep, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, her breathing the deep, even rhythm of the truly exhausted. Perched impossibly, almost comically, on her head was his hat. The dark brown felt, stained with the dust of 100 trails and shaped by his own hand, sat there as if it belonged, a stark, masculine object in a scene of profound vulnerability. It was, he registered with a jolt that went straight through him, the only thing she was wearing. For a long, suspended moment, Marshall simply stood there, frozen in the doorway of the alcove, his mind struggling to reconcile the sight before him with the hard, violent world he inhabited. He had faced down armed men in saloons, stared into the desperate eyes of killers, and felt the cold kiss of a knife against his throat, but nothing had ever thrown him so completely off balance as this. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Yet, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw the faint, dark mottling of bruises on her bare arms and a long, angry scratch that ran from her temple down to her jaw. The narrative in his head shifted instantly. This was not a brazen thief or a wandering saloon girl seeking shelter. This was trouble, yes, but it was trouble that had been pursued, hurt, and had run here as a last resort. Setting his jaw in a hard line, he made a decision. Waking her now, a startled doe to his wolf, would solve nothing and likely get one of them hurt. He could wait. He was a patient man. Retreating as silently as he had entered, Marshall moved back to the hearth. He nudged the dying embers with a poker, adding several small, dry logs from the woodbox until a proper fire began to catch, its nascent flames licking at the wood and casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He filled his tin coffee pot with water from the bucket by the door, added a healthy dose of grounds, and set it on the grate over the fire, the familiar, bracing aroma soon beginning to fill the cabin and chase away the last of the intrusive floral scent. Finally, he settled into his armchair, the one that no longer held the yellow dress, which he had folded and placed carefully on the nearby table, and rested his rifle across his lap. He sat there, a stoic guardian in the firelight, and watched the sleeping form in his bed, the rise and fall of her shoulders under his blankets, the absurd tilt of his hat on her head. The blizzard began to rage outside, the wind howling like a banshee and throwing handfuls of snow against the window panes, but inside the small cabin, a tense, watchful quiet reigned. Marshall waited for the woman in his bed to wake up and tell him exactly what kind of hell she had brought to his door. Surfaced from the depths of a profound and dreamless sleep, pulled toward consciousness not by a sound, but by a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. The suffocating weight of exhaustion that had dragged her down into the darkness was beginning to lift, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache in her muscles and a sharp sting on her cheek. For a blissful, fleeting moment, she knew only warmth and a sense of impossible safety, a stark contrast to the terror and biting cold that had been her reality for what felt like an eternity. Then, awareness returned in a sickening rush. The last thing she remembered was stumbling through a torrential downpour, the forest a terrifying labyrinth of whipping branches and sucking mud, her lungs burning with every ragged breath. She had seen a light, a faint yellow square in the distance, and had collapsed toward it, her last coherent thought a desperate prayer for deliverance. Now she was warm, she was dry, she was in a bed. An unfamiliar weight rested on her head, and her fingers, weak and trembling, lifted to investigate. They brushed against the smooth, stiff curve of worn felt, and the reality of her situation crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. That was a man's hat. Her eyes flew open. The world swam into a blurry focus of wood and firelight, dominated by the towering, formidable silhouette of a man sitting in a chair not 10 feet away from the bed. He was a large man, his shoulders broad enough to block out most of the flickering light from the hearth behind him, and a long rifle rested with casual menace across his thighs. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her by the throat, choking off the scream that tried to claw its way out. She yanked the thick wool blanket up to her chin, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. The movement dislodged the hat, which tumbled onto the pillow beside her. The man didn't move, didn't flinch, his gaze steady and unnervingly calm as he watched her. In the firelight, She could make out the rough texture of a beard and the glint of watchful brown eyes that seemed to miss nothing, assessing her with an intensity that was neither cruel nor kind, but something far more unsettling, professional. He was taking her measure, and she felt as exposed and vulnerable as if the blanket had been ripped away. "Ning," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the cabin. It was a simple word, yet it carried the weight of a judge's pronouncement, demanding an answer, an explanation for her presence in his home, in his bed. Could only stare, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. This was her captor, surely. He had found her. The brief respite, the warmth, the sleep, it had all been a cruel illusion before the next chapter of her nightmare began. But that made no sense. This man was not one of the grimy, leering animals from the Black Creek gang. His stillness was one of power, not of base cruelty, and the cabin, though rustic, was clean and orderly, a reflection of a disciplined mind, not the chaotic squalor of an outlaw camp. The conflict in her mind must have shown on her face, because the man's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a slight easing of the hard line of his jaw. "You're safe here," he stated, not as a reassurance but as a fact. "For now, but I need to know who you are and what you're running from." The directness of his questions, devoid of any preamble, somehow broke through the dam of her fear. The story, the whole horrifying ordeal, came pouring out of her in a torrent of gasping sobs and fragmented sentences. She told him her name was, and spoke of the carriage ride from the east, a journey meant to deliver her to a new life, a new husband, a new everything. She described the sudden, violent ambush on the mountain pass, the terrifying crack of rifles, the scream of the driver, the splintering of wood as the carriage overturned. The faces of the Black Creek gang, led by a vile man named, were seared into her memory. Their cruel laughter, the stink of whiskey on their breath, the casual way they had looted her family's belongings before dragging her away as their prized possession. She recounted the 2 days of captivity, a blur of fear and degradation as they dragged her deeper into the mountains, her fine mustard-yellow dress becoming a tattered rag. Her escape had been an act of pure desperation during a furious thunderstorm that had descended upon their camp. While the men were distracted, wrestling with spooked horses and a collapsing tent, she had slipped away into the maelstrom. She ran blindly, with no sense of direction, the thunder masking the sound of her flight and the torrential rain washing away her tracks. It was the rain that led her to his hat. "I couldn't see," she whispered, her voice cracking, her gaze dropping to the dark felt object on the pillow. "The rain, it was like a solid wall. I saw your cabin, the light, but I kept stumbling, falling. I felt something on the ground, something firm. It was your hat hanging on a post. I put it on just to keep the water out of my eyes so I could keep moving." The last few yards to his door were a blank, a void in her memory. She vaguely recalled finding a key under a stone, a flash of insight born from some long-forgotten story about hiding places, and then the blessed relief of a solid door between her and the storm, before the darkness of utter exhaustion had finally claimed her. Marshall listened to the entire narrative without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. His years as a lawman had made him an expert in the art of the lie. He had heard every kind of fabrication and desperate plea a man or woman could conjure. But this was not a lie. The terror that widened her bright blue eyes was genuine. The tremors that shook her petite frame were not an act, and her story, as wild as it was, aligned perfectly with everything he knew about the Black Creek gang and their recent activities. He had been tracking them for a week before the trail went cold, and the timing of her capture fit. The mention of cinched it was a particularly nasty piece of work, and taking a woman was exactly his style. The bruises darkening her skin were silent witnesses, and the raw fear in her voice was a testimony more powerful than any sworn oath. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of acceptance that seemed to lift a physical weight from shoulders. He rose from the chair then, his tall frame unfolding with a lithe sort of power. For a terrifying second, flinched back, but he didn't move toward her. Instead, he walked over to a large wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, the lid groaning as he lifted it. After a moment of rummaging, he pulled out a thick wool shirt and a pair of dark, homespun trousers. They were his clothes, clean and smelling faintly of cedar. He walked back toward the bed, but stopped a few feet away, placing the folded clothes at its foot. Then he did something that surprised her more than anything else had since she'd woken up. He turned his back to her, presenting her with the broad, protective expanse of his shoulders as he walked over to the fire to pour 2 cups of the now brewing coffee. "Get dressed," he said, his voice softer than before, the command tempered with an implicit offer of privacy and respect. "The coffee's hot. We can talk more once you're feeling steady." In that simple act, a silent contract was forged in the firelit warmth of the cabin. He was her protector, and for the first time since the ambush, allowed herself to believe she might actually survive. The blizzard that had been savior in the forest now became their jailer, descending upon the small valley with a furious, untamed power that seemed determined to erase the world from existence. For 3 days and nights, the wind shrieked and howled around the corners of the cabin, a mournful symphony of nature's rage, while snow piled in great, soft drifts against the door and windows, burying them in a cocoon of white silence. The world outside ceased to be, replaced by a swirling vortex of white that made it impossible to see more than a few feet from the glass. Inside, the single room became their entire universe, a self-contained world smelling of wood smoke, coffee, and the faint, lingering scent of pine. The close confines, which could have easily become a pressure cooker of fear and mistrust, instead became a crucible, slowly and inexorably forging a new and unexpected dynamic between the taciturn lawman and the terrified young woman he had taken under his protection. An awkward, silent dance began, with 2 strangers learning the rhythms of one another in a space that offered no escape from each other's presence. Marshall would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and economical as he stoked the fire and went out to the attached linta to see to his horse, returning with a gust of frigid air and a fresh dusting of snow on his shoulders. Would pretend to be asleep, listening to the solid, reassuring sounds of his routine before finally emerging from the warm nest of blankets on the bed he had surrendered to her, while he took the less comfortable floor by the hearth. The initial tension was a palpable thing, a third presence in the room that sat between them during their mostly silent meals of salted pork and hardtack. Acutely aware of her dependency and her status as an intruder, was desperate to contribute, to prove that she was not just a helpless burden. Her resolve hardened into a plan one afternoon as she watched Marshall methodically cleaning his rifle, his large, calloused hands moving with an expert's familiarity over the steel and wood. She would make dinner. It was a simple task, a domestic ritual she had performed 1,000 times in her family's warm, spacious kitchen back east. Here, in the rustic cabin with its open hearth and heavy iron cookware, it felt like a monumental undertaking, a test of her worth. While Marshall was outside for one of his brief, bracing forays to gather more firewood, she seized her chance. She found 2 thick steaks wrapped in butcher's paper in the cold box, and with a sense of determined purpose, set the heavy skillet over the flames. Her confidence, however, quickly evaporated. The fire, which Marshall controlled with such effortless skill, proved to be a wild and unpredictable beast, flaring up with a sudden intensity that sent flames licking at the handle of the pan. A cloud of acrid, black smoke billowed up toward the rafters, and the sizzling sound of the meat turned into an angry, charring hiss. By the time Marshall returned, the cabin was thick with smoke, and the steaks were 2 blackened, unrecognizable lumps of carbon. Stared at the culinary disaster, the ruin of her good intentions, and felt the hot, prickling sting of tears welling in her eyes. It was all too much, the fear, the exhaustion, the humiliation of her own incompetence. This simple act was meant to be her contribution, and she had failed spectacularly. As a single tear traced a path through the soot on her cheek, she braced herself for his anger, for the gruff disapproval she was sure would come. Instead, a low sound rumbled from deep within Marshall's chest, a sound so foreign and unexpected it took her a moment to identify it. He was chuckling. It started as a quiet vibration and grew into a genuine, hearty laugh, a rich and unguarded sound that completely transformed his stern, bearded face, crinkling the corners of his brown eyes and revealing a warmth she had not imagined he possessed. The absurdity of the situation, the smoke-filled cabin, the ruined dinner, her own crestfallen expression, suddenly struck her as comical. Her own sob hitched in her throat and turned into a watery giggle, which then blossomed into a full, unrestrained laugh, a release of all the pent-up tension and fear that had been strangling her for days. They stood there for a long moment, two unlikely companions laughing together in the haze, the sound echoing in the small space and effectively shattering the wall of silent formality that had stood between them. That evening, as they ate the slightly burnt but edible portions of the steak, the silence was no longer awkward, but comfortable, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the first tentative seeds of conversation. In the days that followed, as the snow continued to fall, the cabin became a place of stories. The words came slowly at first, then with more ease, each disclosure a carefully offered gift, a piece of themselves laid bare in the warm firelight. Marshall, a man who seemed carved from the very mountains around them, spoke of a life defined by duty and solitude. He told her of the endless trails, the lonely campfires, and the constant, wearying dance with the darkest elements of human nature. He never spoke of specific battles or killings, but could read the history of them in the quiet sadness that sometimes shadowed his eyes. He confessed that this small cabin was the only place he felt truly at peace, a world away from the violence and compromise of his profession. In turn, found herself opening up in a way she never had before, sharing dreams she had barely dared to admit to herself. She spoke of her passion for baking, the magical chemistry of flour and sugar and heat, and her quiet ambition to one day open a small bakery, a place filled with the scent of warm bread and the happy chatter of neighbors. It was a life of simple, wholesome creation, a world away from the cold, calculated future her wealthy father had arranged for her, a marriage to a railroad tycoon she had never met, a man who represented not love, but a merger of assets. The intimacy between them grew, nurtured by the forced proximity and the shared vulnerability. One afternoon, when the storm had finally begun to abate, leaving a world of pristine, untouched white in its wake, Marshall declared that it was time she learned how to properly defend herself. He took her outside into the blindingly bright snow, the air so cold it felt sharp in her lungs, and pressed his heavy Colt Peacemaker into her hand. The weight of it was immense, a cold, deadly reality in her palm. He stood behind her, his large frame a solid wall of warmth at her back, his voice a low murmur by her ear as he explained the mechanics of the weapon. To steady her aim, he reached around and covered her smaller hands with his own, his fingers gently adjusting her grip on the handle. The moment his skin touched hers, a jolt of pure electricity shot through, a sudden, breath-stealing awareness that had nothing to do with the cold or the weapon she held. His proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, smell the clean, masculine scent of leather and winter air, and feel his breath stir the curls at her temple. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, the gentle strength of his hands encasing hers, and the air between them became thick and charged, crackling with an unspoken energy that was far more powerful and dangerous than the gunpowder waiting in the pistol's chamber. He was no longer just her protector. He was a man, and she was a woman, and in the silent, snow-covered wilderness, that simple truth had become impossible to ignore. The fragile, charged moment between them, suspended in the crystalline air, was shattered by the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoing through the valley. It was followed instantly by the wet, sickening thud of a bullet striking flesh and wood. Instinct took over Marshall. In a single, fluid motion, he shoved behind him, pushing her toward the solid cover of the cabin wall as he drew his own Colt, his eyes scanning the dense line of snow-laden pines that bordered the clearing. The idyllic peace of their sanctuary had been violated, the spell of their growing intimacy broken by the brutal intrusion of the world he inhabited. Another shot rang out, this one wilder, followed by a choked cry of pain from the direction of the woods. Marshall moved low and fast, using a stack of firewood as cover, his gaze fixed on the spot where the sound had originated. He saw movement, a dark shape stumbling from between the trees before collapsing into the deep snow, leaving a crimson stain spreading like a fatal bloom on the pristine white canvas. His training screamed ambush, but his gut told him this was something else, the desperate end of a chase. With his gun still raised, he cautiously approached the fallen figure, signaling for to stay put. The man in the snow was a mess of blood and torn clothing, but Marshall recognized him instantly as one of the Black Creek Gang, a low-level thug named. He was gut-shot, bleeding out fast, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. But as Marshall knelt beside him, the outlaw's eyes, glazed with pain and a feverish hatred, didn't focus on the lawman. They looked past him, locking onto who had crept out from behind the cabin, her face pale with dread. A gurgling, bloody grin Split's face. "There you are," he rasped, his voice a horrifying parody of a greeting. "Pretty little prize." Marshall's hand tightened on his pistol, a cold fury rising in him, but before he could demand answers, the dying man began to spill his story, the words tumbling out in a final, venomous confession. "He paid us." "You know," coughed, fresh blood speckling his lips and the snow around him. Your own daddy, paid a fortune to snatch you, just to throw a scare into you, make you run right into the arms of that railroad man he picked out for you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The blood drained from his face, leaving her ghostly white, her bright blue eyes wide with a dawning horror that was somehow worse than the terror of her abduction. The man's words were a poison, seeping into her and corroding the very foundations of her world. The outlaw wasn't finished. With a final surge of malicious energy, he revealed the rest of the sordid tale. The plan, he sneered, had gone wrong from the start. Had taken one look at in the bag of her father's gold and decided he wouldn't be honoring his end of the bargain. He was keeping both. The supposed kidnapping to frighten her had become a very real one. His final, wheezing words were a warning, a piece of information he likely traded in the hopes of some final, meaningless revenge against the leader who had left him for dead. "He's heading to redemption," he gasped out. "Big railroad payroll. Coming in tomorrow. You're the coward." Gave all the details. The schedule, the guards. His price for looking the other way. With that, the outlaw's eyes rolled back in his head, and a final, shuddering breath escaped his lips, leaving an echoing silence in the clearing, a silence more profound and terrible than the blizzard's howl had ever been. The fragile young woman Marshall had nursed back from the brink of terror vanished in that moment, consumed by a new and terrible fire. The betrayal was a wound far deeper than any physical injury, a clean, sharp cut that severed the last ties of filial duty and affection. Her grief transformed into a white-hot, diamond-hard fury. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and her eyes, when they met Marshall's, were no longer filled with fear, but with an icy, unwavering resolve. Marshall's world had also been irrevocably altered. His duty as a lawman was now inextricably intertwined with a fierce, personal need to protect this woman, not just from outlaws, but from the callous machinations of her own family. The lines of his job had blurred into the landscape of his heart. He had to stop the robbery and redemption, but more than that, he had to stand by her, to be the one solid, trustworthy thing in her shattered world. "I'll handle this," he said, his voice low and firm. "You'll be safe here until I get back." "No," his voice was quiet but rang with the clarity of a steel bell. "I am not a parcel to be hidden away for my own safety. This involves me, my father, the man I was supposed to marry. That money is being stolen because of me. I am going with you." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "You taught me how to shoot, Marshall. I will not be a victim in this story any longer. I will see it through to the end." He looked at the fierce determination etched onto her features, at the fire burning in her eyes, and he knew that arguing would be as futile as trying to hold back the tide. More than that, he recognized the truth in her words. She was safer with him than she would be waiting alone, a potential target for any of his remaining men. He gave a single, sharp nod of assent. The decision was made. They rode out within the hour, 2 horses thundering through the snow-covered landscape, leaving the sanctuary of the isolated cabin behind. They were no longer a marshal and a witness, but partners, 2 solitary souls bound together by a shared purpose and an unspoken, powerful attraction, riding headlong into a storm of bullets and betrayal. They reached the outskirts of redemption as the sun bled its last orange and purple light across the horizon, casting the dusty main street in long, ominous shadows. The town was coiled tight with a nervous energy, the few citizens still out hurrying along with their heads down. Using the outlaw's dying words, Marshall pieced together a desperate plan. The payroll would be in the express office, and his men would hit it just after the last train pulled out. Marshall, a lawman with a plan, was worth 10 thugs acting on greed. He would confront them directly, using the element of surprise, while created a critical diversion at the livery stable, spooking the gang's horses to cut off their escape. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only one they had. The ensuing gunfight was a maelstrom of chaos and noise, the roar of pistols echoing between the clapboard buildings. Marshall moved with the deadly, efficient grace of a predator, his Colt a natural extension of his will, each shot finding its mark with grim precision. But he was outnumbered, and the outlaws, fighting with the desperation of cornered rats, pressed their advantage. Just as one of them flanked him, raising a shotgun for a final, devastating blast, a series of shots cracked through the air from an unexpected direction, the second-story window of the hotel across the street. The man with the shotgun cried out and crumpled to the ground. It was. She had done more than just spook the horses. She had armed herself with the rifle from Marshall's saddle, found a superior vantage point, and become a guardian angel in a borrowed wool shirt. Her covering fire was precise and deadly, giving Marshall the opening he needed to systematically dismantle the rest of the gang. The final, brutal confrontation happened in the middle of the street, a primal dance between Marshall and... It was a desperate, ugly brawl of fists and knees, but as Marshall looked past his snarling adversary and saw, safe and fierce, and very much alive in the hotel window, a surge of protective strength he had never known coursed through him. He ended the fight with a single, decisive blow that left unconscious in the dust. As the townspeople slowly emerged from their hiding places, it was who descended the hotel stairs and faced down her father's trembling, cowardly business partner, her voice clear and strong as she exposed the entire, sordid conspiracy for all to hear. Days later, back in the profound and welcome quiet of the cabin, the peace felt different. It was no longer the silence of solitude, but the silence of shared contentment. Stood on the small porch, leaning against a post as she watched the sun dip below the jagged peaks, the sky a masterpiece of soft pinks and deep indigos. She had done what she needed to do, refusing to press charges against her father but severing all ties, an act that felt more like liberation than loss. She was finally, truly, on her own. Marshall came to stand beside her, the comfortable silence stretching between them, laden with all the things that had happened and all the things that were now possible. He reached over to the peg by the door where his hat hung, its familiar shape a silent witness to their entire story. With a gentleness that seemed almost foreign to his large, calloused hands, he took the hat and placed it softly on her head, the brim dipping low over her eyes. Tilted her head back to look up at him, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face, her blue eyes shining in the twilight. "You know," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "I'm starting to get very fond of this hat." A gruff, emotional sound caught in his throat. "It looks better on you anyway," he managed to say, his own voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, let alone show. She reached up, not to adjust the hat, but to gently trace the line of his bearded jaw with her fingertips, her touch sending a shiver of warmth through him that had nothing to do with the evening chill. "Marshall," she whispered, her name a question and an answer all at once. He didn't need any more words. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that wasn't about the desperate relief of survival or the heated charge of attraction, but about the quiet, profound certainty of coming home. It was a kiss that sealed the promise of 1,000 shared sunrises, of a future built not on duty or obligation, but on a love forged in fire and snow. He wrapped his strong arms around her, pulling her close against him, the ridiculous angle of his hat on her head pressing into his chest. His solitary life, the one he had so carefully constructed and fiercely guarded, was over. He was home, and so, at long last, was she.